Small business war stories. Small businesses are the soul of America. And this is where they tell their stories. I am your host, Pablo Fuentes. Hey, lovers of small businesses and good stories in general. Welcome to episode 140 of Small Business War Stories. And this episode is very special. I mean, I say that a lot because they are very special. But this one, we're actually doing two things that we've never done in 139 prior episodes of Small Business War Stories. You ready? Number one, this episode is an interview with Bruce Iglauer, who is the founder of Alligator Records, which is an iconic blues music label that's been very successful for decades, based out of Chicago. And this episode will include music. We're actually going to intersperse music as we talk about it. The really cool things Bruce, the stories that he tells, we're going to actually, when he talks about, hey, we made this record, or here's what we did with this artist, we're going to pop in some tracks, and this is all courtesy of Alligator Records and Bruce. So thank you very much, Bruce. And our conversation was so long, and it was very much worthwhile, that I decided to break this into two different episodes. So 140 this week and 141 next week are both going to be with Bruce Iglauer, and they're both going to be with music. The stories in these episodes are unbelievable. I mean, there's like literally a story of like heroic life-saving. I won't even get into it. We'll get into that in next week's episode. But this week, we talk about so much, some funny stuff. We'll talk about Bruce's opinion of the Rolling Stones. That's the funny stuff. But also some really inspiring stuff, how he essentially got started with an independent blues label that ended up changing the landscape for music in America as we know it. So it was extraordinarily exciting for me to do this episode. And again, we're doing two new things. First one, music in the episode. And second one, we're splitting this one into two different episodes. If you enjoy this, if you know anyone who likes music, who likes small businesses, definitely a lot of lessons for small businesses here. Bruce faced a lot of uphill battles in his quest, and still does. I mean, the Alligator is still going strong. Please do share this. Share this with a friend, somebody whom you think would appreciate this. I would be very, very thankful to you for doing that. Without further ado, let's get into today's episode, which is the first part of my interview with Bruce Iglauer of Alligator Records in Chicago, Illinois. And we are live here in beautiful Chicago, Illinois. And today I have the pleasure and honor to sit down with the one, the only Bruce Iglauer, who is the founder of Alligator Records. And we happen to be in a room full of both alligators and records.
Not live ones.
Not live ones. There's a lot of stuffed alligators here. I presume. Do you collect alligators, or other people?
No, other people give me alligator tchotchkes, ranging from very large stuffed alligators to little alligator toys and squirt guns and necklaces. And I always smile and act like it was the first person who thought to give me an alligator gift.
And there are plenty of them here, and I'm sure we're not exhibiting all of them, right?
Oh, there are plenty in my office and elsewhere. There is one that I particularly prize.
Uh-huh.
It's just a rubber one. It's not unusual, but it was a doorstop in the home of Lillian Shedd McMurray, who ran the Trumpet Records label in Jackson, Mississippi in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, and is a huge hero to me.
Okay.
And she gave it to me.
That's your prized alligator.
It's my
your
favorite.
most prized alligator.
Yes.
Awesome. So you're a legend in the record industry and in the blues world. And somebody, you basically started doing this. I mean, I don't want to steal your thunder, but out of a deep love and passion and appreciation for this, and managed to make an entire living and career out of it for several decades, which is more than most people who ever started doing this can say.
When I started Alligator back in 1971,
Yeah.
there were a number of other blues fans, more or less my age,
Yeah.
just out of college or in their early 20s, who started labels and released one or two records, sometimes good ones, and were very, very dedicated and in love with the music, but they didn't want to learn the business to go with it. So they figured out how to go in the studio and have the fun part, which is making the record and making the package. But then when they actually had to sell something and make enough money to make another record, they didn't know how to do it, or they didn't just want to do it.
Right.
When I started, I could afford to make one record. I had $2,500. That was my entire grub stake to start a label, which was a ridiculous amount of money. I could have started with $25,000 and done something. So with $2,500, I recorded and pressed 1,000 copies of one record, recorded direct to 2-track, mixed it as we went, with my favorite band in the world, Hound Dog Taylor and the House Rockers.
Which happened to turn into, to call that a hit would be an understatement.
Well, by blues standards, certainly. In the United States, it sold over 100,000 copies, and probably another 50,000 elsewhere in the world over the years. And we made the record in 2 evenings in 8 hours with a 3-piece band straight out of the South Side, out of Florence's Lounge.
And here we're going to pop in a little bit of Hound Dog Taylor. So this is a song that's one of my personal favorites, called Give Me Back My Wig, which really personifies and exemplifies the really high energy, badass style that Hound Dog Taylor had.
And they just played the music that they were doing every weekend.
Yeah.
And I recorded it, and it was so good. And I have to pat myself on the back and say I worked so hard to get the public to know it existed.
Yeah.
That we actually managed to start a label. I managed to start a label by myself with one record, and sold enough of that to make the second record.
And I cheated a little bit. I read your book called Bitten by the Blues, where you actually tell this and a lot of other stories. So I'm going to go into some of these stories, but some of this early hustle included you going around the country in your car with a trunk full of records and talking to radio stations, right? So there was a lot of...
I started Alligator during the most glorious moment in American radio history.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 1960s, a DJ named Tom Donahue started playing rock album cuts on an FM station in San Francisco. And very quickly, that format spread across the country, and it was called either progressive rock or freeform. Now, at that time, there was very little music on FM radio at all. It was all AM. It was all top 40 and country and soul. So FM was just kind of an empty band, often owned by a radio station that did nothing with it. Mm-hmm. And so people of my age, I graduated college in 1969, basically talked station owners into letting them go onto the FM band and play album tracks like they were playing in the dorm. Mm-hmm. And sell ads to the local waterbed store and and the head shop, for $10 at the spot.
Yeah.
And these people would program all their own shows, and the best stations would play rock, that you might hear a Stones cut, and then you might hear a Pete Seeger song, you might hear a short classical piece, you might hear some Miles Davis, and then you might hear some B.B. King. Mm-hmm. It was foreground listening. When you listen to stations like that, you were thinking, this DJ is trying to have me experience something musically.
As opposed to it being like an elevator, shopping center music in the background.
Right. Yeah. And the DJs were on-air personalities, not in the old sense of, being hypey, but more talking to the audience like they were somebody who was in the dorm. talking with their enthusiasm about music. I remember when I came to Chicago in 1970, I didn't grow up here, there were two stations that were playing this format, and one of them was out in Oak Park, which is a close-in suburb. And I was working at Delmark Records, which is a blues and jazz label that predates Alligator by 15 years, and working for its founder, Bob Kester, one of my great heroes in life. And he had a store called the Jazz Record Mart. And one day, Elvin Jones, the great jazz drummer, came in there shopping for some records. And he didn't have a gig that night. So I called up the midnight DJ on WGLD and said, would you like Elvin Jones on your show? And he said, sure. So I picked up Elvin Jones, drove him to Oak Park, and he was on the radio for 2.5 hours, basically as a guest DJ, unannounced, in the middle of the night. And the DJ on the air didn't have to clear it with the music director or the program director or anybody. It was his show, and he could do what he wanted to.
And you were going around the country basically seeking these folks, or these kinds of folks, who could then hopefully popularize the record that you just made.
Exactly. I pressed 1,000 copies. I had a Chicago distributor, and in those days, you didn't have one national distributor because it was LPs, and you couldn't be shipping them all over the country, overnight like you can with CDs. So you'd have a distributor in every city. Mm-hmm. I started with one, which was here in Chicago. Then I got in my car with the other 900 copies. I gave them 100, and I drove to Detroit. Mm-hmm. And instead of going to the distributor, I went to WABX, and I met the DJ going on the air, and I said something like, I'm a blues fan, and I spent my money to record my very favorite band, Hound Dog Taylor and the House Rockers, and this is my album, and would you please put it on the air? Would you listen to it at least?
I know a guy just like that.
and amazingly, a lot of these DJs who could program whatever they wanted to, just looked and they said, wow, that's a picture of this funky black guy, with the hat on and this real cheap guitar. Yeah. And, I think I'll just spin this and see what it sounds like.
Is that the particular guitar that's in the room with us right now, or is that a different one?
No, that's the guitar that's about 6 feet away from us right now.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's the $50 Japanese guitar that Hound Dog Taylor recorded his first album on. He had a different $50 Japanese guitar for the second album.
Yep.
We only did two before he died. Mm-hmm. And then the first album, he had a Sears Roebuck Silvertone amplifier. Yep. For you guitar fans, built by Dan Electro.
Yep. And then the second one you said was currently held by Dan Auerbach.
The second guitar that Hound Dog had, it was called Kingston, and you know more about guitars than I do. But it was made by one of the cheap. In those days, made in Japan meant cheap and shoddy, not like now.
Yep.
And Dan Auerbach, whom I met when the Black Keys were, before they were signed, he's a huge Hound Dog Taylor fan. And he approached me through a mutual friend of ours, asking me about Hound Dog's guitars. And Hound Dog's wife had given them to me after he died. And I just held on to them. I had one at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a while on loan. And Dan said, I'd love to own one of these guitars and play it.
Yeah.
And I knew which one was more playable. I was real hesitant to give up the guitars, but they weren't doing anything. They were sitting in my living room.
Yeah.
So I gave Dan the guitar, and Dan made an extremely generous contribution to the Heart Fund of the Blues Foundation in Memphis, which helps out musicians who are having health crises or their families are. Yeah. In some cases, pays for funerals. So they were doing really good work, and I thought, if Hound Dog were alive, the Heart Fund might be where he'd be going if he needed some help. So it seemed an appropriate way to do things.
It comes full circle.
Dan, as far as I know, hasn't played it on stage yet.
Yeah.
But maybe he has, and he intends to. And he's promised me that when he can't play it anymore, if I'm not around, that he will find a good home for it.
Okay. Yeah, he was. Yeah, this is actually oddly cosmically connected because I recently recorded an episode with Walter Carter Vintage Guitars, and he happened to be at Carter Vintage Guitars while we were recording that podcast. And he's by the way, did you ever think about signing the Black Keys?
Well, it's funny you should mention it. My art director, Kevin Niemick, told me about a band he had seen at one of these clubs. It's a place called the Beat Kitchen here in Chicago, where they had 8 bands a night for 20 minutes each, and you'd go and you paid $5, and you'd tell them which band you came to see, and the band would get part of the $5.
Yeah.
So he told me about this band that he really liked, and he thought they were a little out for me, but I might like them, and I should go see them. But the next time they came to town, I was ill. So the time after that, I went to see him, did like him, really wanted to hear more than 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Engaged them in conversation. They were, as soon as I said Hound Dog Taylor, they were all over me. It was just the fact that I had known Hound Dog Taylor was just thrilling to them. And they said, "Oh, it's too bad we just signed with Fat Possum."
Oh.
So if I had managed to not have a cold, they might be on Alligator, or at least their first album might be on Alligator.
Wow, that's wild. The Big Come Up, right? The Big Come Up was on a different label. And then they did Fat Possum, and then they did Nonsuch. I don't know. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different...
I don't know the order of releases.
Yeah.
But they were much bluesier then, and plenty raw.
Yeah.
And Hound Dog would have liked him.
That's awesome. I'm sure Dan would appreciate that. So Dan Auerbach, if you're listening to this, well, or when you listen to this, Hound Dog would have liked it. So let's talk a little bit more about that hustle, about that, because a lot of people... And a theme that happened, I mean, in the 140 interviews or so that we've done, a big theme is people pursuing something that they're really excited about, passionate about, and then how people are able or not able to turn that into a livelihood. And you talked a little bit about people want to do the fun stuff, but not the non-fun stuff. What are some examples you can think back of the things that maybe some of your peers who were making good records back then did not do or did not want to do, that you did, that enabled you to withstand? And we'll get into a little bit of how the music industry is evolving, because that's a fascinating topic to me and to a lot of people. But what are some of the blocking, tackling things and proactive things that you did that you think made a big difference in the outcomes?
Well, nobody was giving away promo copies to radio and press like I was. We talked about my driving around the country. What I didn't say is the next day after getting airplay, I went to the distributor who I'd put together a list of potential distributors. I didn't want the little tiny one-man distributors that Delmark had and other little labels had. I wanted distributors that had big labels, so they'd be talking to the big stores. I went to the distributor and I said, "I'm getting airplay on 3 stations in your marketplace. Would you like to distribute this record?" And of course, I had done all the heavy lifting, so he said, "Sure." And I left 100 copies out of my trunk, and drove to Cleveland and did the same thing, and then to Albany and Buffalo and Hartford and Boston and New York and Philadelphia.
Well, but the math, you can
DC.
only do that about 8 times.
By the time I got to Cleveland, I talked the Cleveland distributor, who was kind of a friend of mine, into fronting me a little money, and I wired it back to the pressing plant and said, "Press another 1,000."
Yeah, and ship them to me.
No, actually, I managed to just get through my 1,000 on the road.
Okay.
I came back with an empty trunk.
Okay.
So then I was pursuing press like crazy. Rock and roll media was somewhat new. A Rolling Stone started in 68 or 69. This is only 71. So the idea of a magazine dedicated to music and to music for people of my generation was something pretty new. So I chased Rolling Stone, I chased Cream, I chased every magazine that came out, and constantly giving away hundreds and hundreds of promo copies, which none of my competitors were prepared to do. Beyond that, I printed up a little Hound Dog poster, and I remember sitting on the floor of my one-room apartment where I was running the label with my manual typewriter, typing labels to every radio station that had played Hound Dog Taylor and sending them a poster and a thank you note. No copying machine. Everyone was hand typed. I packed every promo copy myself for decades, and every shipment. And I don't sleep very much.
Yeah, that's an unreasonable amount of work to do for something that presumably wasn't making a ton of money. And that's something that you talk about in your book too. But what kept you going? Like, I mean, what are the things? And also, I do want to make sure we hit on like other things that you think are important for people to think about as they think about turning a passion into a business, because that's a theme that come back over and over again.
Well, there were a few things that kept me going. First of all, I had a vision that I could grow the marketplace and the fan base for the music that I loved. I thought maybe I can make a living doing this. I mean, it was 5 years before I had an employee. I was doing everything myself. But I saw Hound Dog Taylor go from playing for 80 people at Florence's Lounge on the South Side to touring Australia and New Zealand and playing with a package of blues artists, but playing arenas and huge auditoriums. He wasn't the headliner, but he was there. I never got him to Europe, but had he lived a little longer, that would have happened as well. So I saw that something could be developed. I saw that somebody could go from playing little bars to playing for big audiences. And of course, from playing, as Hound Dog did, entirely for African American people when I saw him first, to playing for primarily white people, because that was the new generation of blues fans. So I could see that something could be developed. And then, of course, I kept hearing music that needed to be recorded. I heard Big Walter Horton playing with Carrie Bell and heard these two harmonica players interacting, and it was thrilling. And I thought, this has got to be on a record. And then I heard Sun Seals at the Expressway Lounge on the south side of Chicago actually filling in for Hound Dog Taylor, who was out on the road.
Yeah.
And he didn't even own an amp. He was playing on a borrowed amp. And something grabbed me. And I thought, this guy can reach some real deep parts of me.
Right.
And if he can reach those deep parts of me, he can reach those deep parts of other people too.
Yeah. And here, I mean, we'll put some, I talked about, you had this amazing idea before we even started recording about, kind of cutting in snippets of some of this music into the show. So we'll certainly be sharing some of that with the audience.
We shared the old adage about talking about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yeah.
So let's let the people hear some music.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we will. And we'll certainly cover a lot of ground on that front too.
So the other thing was that I had to prove to myself in the world that I could do it.
Right.
There was a sense of, this is my challenge. The gauntlet, I've thrown down the gauntlet in front of myself, but also I tried to convince my boss, Bob Kester at Delmark, to record Hound Dog Taylor. I tried to convince him for over a year. Now, I have to say the caveat was I wanted to produce it, which I was probably completely unequipped to do, but I couldn't talk him into it because he had never seen Hound Dog with his own band, and without his own band, Hound Dog was kind of a disaster. So part of it was I was going to show my father figure, my mentor, that I could do it as well as he could do it, and maybe better. And he'll see, like
chip on the shoulder,
showing Dad, that you can be a success. So there was a little of that in me as well. I never thought to give up. Once I started on this road, I just wanted to be on that road. And it's so thrilling to stand in an audience when one of my artists is performing and have the audience be excited and moved and energized and, maybe just have a whole lot of fun because of what the artist is doing. And my knowing that my role in getting that artist and that audience connected was essential to the artist's career.
Right.
And also, there are very few people who have committed themselves to this particular genre of music and tried to make something go with that. So, sadly, I don't have a lot of competitors. There's so many good musicians, I would like to have more opportunities for the musicians to record.
Yeah.
But my competitors either didn't make it in the first place or, now I'm an old guy. So a bunch of them have retired and sold their labels. And I'm not seeing somebody come up. There's nobody barking on my heels, and I wish there were.
But there's a weird thing, and I don't know if this is limited to the blues. Maybe you can tell me, but I've gotten the sense that in the blues music industry, there's a little bit of a zero-sum mentality, which I think is incorrect. Meaning, like, people are thinking, like, well, if you sell more records, that means I'll sell fewer records, which I think is not true. I think the more interest you're able to generate and garner for all different performers of a genre, that makes the genre more prominent, which means everybody sells more records. And I don't know, is that something that's exclusive to the blues, that zero-sum mentality?
Oh, boy. I haven't really given that specific thought, but I can tell you that when a blues-based artist becomes popular outside of the blues market, and it's been a long time since that's happened, but the most obvious example being Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Yeah. Gary Clark Jr. recently.
Gary has not been, and this isn't Gary's fault, but Gary has not been recognized as much as carrying on the blues tradition as Stevie was. Mm-hmm. Maybe because Stevie was such a public figure about talking about Albert King and about all of the people who influenced him, that he shined the spotlight on them. But as a result of Stevie Ray Vaughan, and earlier than that, Johnny Winter and Clapton and John Mayall, people were turned on to the blues and bought records and booked artists.
And here, since we just talked about Johnny Winter, I do want to show you one of the songs that he did with Alligator. They did a few albums. They did this is all in Bruce's book, Bitten by the Blues, but they did Guitar Slinger, and then as well as Serious Business, and then he was also in a couple of Alligator compilations. Johnny Winter is a Texas guitarist who kind of went mainstream with rock blues, and then went back to kind of the roots of blues with Alligator, and then went back out again and went mainstream again. But this is a song that I particularly like from Johnny called Don't Take Advantage of Me.
Yeah. Don't take advantage of me, 'cause I'm good to you. Don't take advantage of me, 'cause I'm good to you. I'm just another man hooked on you. Tell me, baby, what the hell you gonna do? I wanna know. I wanna know. Oh, yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, even though I know artists who felt like, hey, we created this music and you guys are kind of exploiting it, the reality is that the popularity of Stevie Ray Vaughan and Johnny Winter and Eric Clapton, and maybe Gary Clark Jr. to some extent.
And the Rolling Stones is a good example.
Yes,
of that,
the early Rolling Stones for sure, who, let me just say that they were not my favorite blues band.
Okay.
But their love, it was. Somebody will throw something at me for this, but I just said the other day, if only they had had a good singer.
I don't know. We just saw them in Houston a few weeks ago, and they still got it, man.
Well, quick side story. One of the people I recorded after I decided I could actually record some white people too was Lonnie Mack.
Yep.
And Lonnie Mack was a guitar player from southern Indiana who had some hit singles on rock and roll radio in the mid-1960s, and was honestly probably the first blues rock guitar hero. He was a guy who grew up on blues, R&B, and country music and mixed them all together, and was a fabulous guitar player and a grumpy son of a gun. And did things that kind of helped destroy his career as well as build it. But we did a Lonnie Mack record that was released at the beginning of 1985. And Lonnie got a gig at the Lone Star, a big club in New York, and I went because it was a record release event, and I was in the balcony, which was the VIP area, and sitting at the next table were Keith Richard and Ron Wood, and Ron Wood knew I was with Lonnie, and he kept poking me and asking me questions. Is that his original Flying V? Is that Flying V number 11? Does he have a special tuning? When did he install the Bigsby tailpiece? He was just being a total fan.
Yeah.
And it was completely charming and real and honest. And
He's a huge guitar geek.
Yeah, and Keith was clearly feeding him some of the questions.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, what a couple of nice guys.
Yeah.
I didn't get any ego at all. Keith is somebody I've wanted to get to know, actually.
Yeah.
So my issues are only with the
Keith
singer.
Richards, I know you're listening to this as well. Bruce wants to get to know you. Just sending out.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sure Keith listens all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas I never had any particular interest in knowing Mick Jagger.
Okay.
Sorry, Mick, you can turn off the show now.
Yeah, there you go. You can go back to dancing around. So let's.
He is a really great Tina Turner imitator, though.
Yeah. Oh wow. We'll put that quote in the show notes. What? Let's bring this back full circle.
It's too late. It's too late for me to hide my dislike of his vocals. as far as the rest of him, I don't know him, so I don't dislike him as a person.
Sounds good. Let's bring this back full circle to where we started. So, how do you get more people excited about getting into the music industry? And how do you get people thinking about it in a non-zero sum way, right? Like, how do you get people thinking more about, 1 + 1 = 3, and like the rising tide lifts all boats? And how do you get people thinking about continuing to get passionate about this and carry on the legacy of the kind of things that you've done? Because it's also a changing landscape that changes weekly as to what's going on with the industry, period.
Well, how people are experiencing music has changed completely since I was young. I remember going to first of all, I grew up on Top 40 radio, and that was repeating the hits over and over again. When LPs started to be the standard way people listen to music, I remember a lot of people, whether in dorm rooms or living rooms, going over to somebody's house and sitting and carefully listening to a record together. And one of the things that I loved about LPs was 20 minutes of a side was really digestible. And
do you want to take your phone call?
It's not necessarily, it's probably spam.
All right.
20 minutes of an LP side was really digestible.
Yeah.
And people listened to records over and over again and talked about them. They were a very important cultural experience and kind of a little bit sacred. People didn't think as much when LPs came out about background music. They were paying attention to the music. And then we started getting all this other media and so many ways that media could be delivered to you. So we went from LPs, which you almost had to listen to in your living room because you couldn't play them in your car, to cassettes, which mostly sounded crappy, and then to CDs, which once they figured out how to do them right, was a good format because they're hard to break and you can play them in your car. But meanwhile, we've had this situation with people wanting to own media less and less. We're sitting in a room with a wall of LPs, and in the next room there are multiple shelf units of CDs and more upstairs.
Yeah.
But I have grandchildren. My grandchildren don't own music. They stream music. They listen to music. Sometimes they trade music. But as far as they're concerned, it's a much more ephemeral experience. The idea of sitting down and listening and doing nothing else is hard for them.
Yeah.
Because they're texting, they're watching a movie, they're they're reading a book.
Yeah.
They have the TV on, all at the same time.
So how do you make a business out of that?
Well, you make records that will stand the test of time. You make records that have emotional value, records that do things to the listener that can't be done casually, records that demand foreground listening. Then, because I have to adapt to the streaming mentality. It's not what I like, but it's the way people are experiencing music now. Then I think about the world market. One of the most exciting things that's happened to us, even though it hasn't turned into money yet, is our music is now available to stream in India and even more so in China. And it's available on the 3 biggest streaming services in China. Now, that didn't happen because they came to me. It happened because the independent music industry has always had a sort of a self-help philosophy. There's an organization called Merlin, based in England, which is an organization of independent labels, and their job is entirely to make digital deals for independent labels as a group. And you can't do that in the U.S. because it's against trade practices.
Oh.
But you can do it in England. So they can negotiate for all of us. So Tencent and NetEase in China didn't come saying, we want Alligator Records. They came to Merlin and said, we want a bunch of your labels. And that includes the Beggars Group, which has huge hits. And Merlin said, if you want that, then you want all of our members. And so they made the deal. I have the choice of opting out of that deal, but I didn't. I opted in because even though the amounts of money we're making are ridiculously tiny,
right?
Because there's a fascination with Black American music worldwide, and even though we're unknown in China, sooner or later we will be discovered. And remember that with the population of China, if 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 people falls in love with the blues, that's bigger than the blues fan base in the United States.
Yeah. And I've also heard that in Japan, physical CDs are making a comeback. That they sell quite a few of them.
Yeah. They're certainly not going down.
Right.
I don't know. The Japanese mentality for me is a little bit of a mystery. Japanese people have become westernized in certain ways. I've been to Japan a few times on tour with Albert Collins and Little Ed and the Blues Imperials and Koko Taylor.
Yeah. Not
recently, but there was a little blues boom in Japan. But why they make their cultural decisions is still not clear to me. I need more education.
And this is a great opportunity for us to share a little bit of music from these fantastic artists. So since Bruce mentioned Koko Taylor, Little Ed, and the Blues Imperials, and Albert Collins as it pertains to their touring in Japan, let's first go into Albert Collins, If Trouble Was Money.
If trouble was money, I swear I'll be a millionaire. I said, if trouble was money, baby, I swear I'll be a millionaire. If worries was dollar bills, I'd buy the whole world and have money to spare.
And now let me share some of Koko Taylor with you. If you're interested in hearing and learning more about the story of Koko and Bruce, there is quite a bit more in the story in the book in Bitten by the Blues. But Koko Taylor is a fantastic blues vocalist who really impressed Bruce with her professionalism and her persistence. She was really trying to work with Bruce for a long time, and they were very successful together. This is a cut that I really like called It Took a Long Time.
Say
And last but not least, from this little detour here into the Japanese tour, here's Little Ed and the Blues Imperials with Tired of Crying. And Bruce is going to talk a little bit more about the story of Little Ed and the Blues Imperials a little bit later. But this is a great spot to insert this song.
But yes, you can sell some CDs in Japan. What's hard is I have a terrible time getting the blues on the radio in Japan.
Okay.
And people are still very influenced by radio. Okay. You read other things, but it's.
How big is radio here in the U.S.?
Radio for us in the U.S. is a struggle. After the boom period of progressive rock freeform, that began ending in the mid-1970s. And the reason it began ending is those stations discovered that they could get bigger advertisers, that instead of the head shop and the natural food restaurant, they could get Oldsmobile or Buick, but they needed better ratings. They began worrying about ratings, and then they began tightening up the playlists,
right,
and tightening. And there was there began to be consultants,
right,
and who would advise radio stations what to play. And one of the consultants for this form of radio, which was now no longer freeform, was called Album Rock, said, and this is a direct quote, "Black music is the kiss of death to rock and roll radio." Not too racist, huh?
That's not only racist, but also patently untrue.
Well, sure, it's untrue, but if you listen to many rock and roll stations, including stations that are more album-oriented, in fact, more so on stations that are album-oriented than stations that are singles-oriented, the black musicians you're likely to hear are going to be dead, like Jimi Hendrix, are going to be oldies artists, like an old Motown track or something.
Like Sam Cooke.
Yeah,
like
sure. And you mentioned Gary Clark Jr., but here WXRT, which used to be a flagship station of what the format morphed into what's called AAA, Adult Album Alternative. And for a while it was pretty blues friendly, but again, it got absorbed by big companies. WXRT, which was an independent station for decades here in Chicago, is now owned by CBS. And
right, that's part of the problem too, is that a lot of it used to be hundreds of stations, and now it's really just a handful of conglomerates that own these groups. And like you had these folks that were local that were excited about playing things. Now they're just playlists like handed down from a suit in a different thing in a different office that doesn't really know much about what's going on with that scene.
Right, and the development of internet and satellite radio has been good, but the problem I have with Sirius XM, who are very supportive of us and have some really great people working for them, is you can hear Alligator Records on Sirius XM all the time on one station, which is B.B. King's Bluesville. Occasionally, something that's a little more Americana-ish will get on a station they call Outlaw Country, but there's nothing that is going to introduce people to new genres of music. I'd love it if XM Sirius had something like the old freeform radio, where they'd mix up genres of music, and people would discover things. Pandora, to their credit, has done a really good job with creating a discovery system online.
Yeah.
And we work with all of these people.
Now, there are people who are carrying the torch forward. So we talked about our mutual friend, Chris Owen Ingram, Kingfish.
Yes, who's signed to Alligator.
Who's signed to Alligator.
Turned 20 in January.
Yeah.
He's from Mississippi. And
he played at the White House when he was 15 or 16 or something like that.
Right, and he's now been touring with, of all bands, Vampire Weekend.
It's funny you say that, because that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, because he and a few other folks, actually Gary Clark Jr. too, have been doing dates with people who are not exactly like them, right? So do you think that's a good strategy for audience expansion or not?
I think that anytime you could open people's ears, including my ears, it's good.
Yeah.
There's so much good and interesting music out here, and it's impossible to hear everything. Vampire Weekend, I have not met them, and I didn't go to any of the shows with Kingfish. Kingfish is his professional name,
right?
With Kingfish and Vampire Weekend, but I understand he was reasonably well received, and the Vampire Weekend brought him up for the encore.
Yeah.
And they picked him because they saw him online.
Yeah.
It was a YouTube thing. And I think that's great. And I bow to Vampire Weekend for doing that, because they could have just picked another pop band that appeals to the same audience and probably maybe put more butts in the seats. Because Kingfish is not putting butts in the seats of Vampire Weekend fans. They're learning about him. I would love to see more of this. There was a time, when the Stones had Ike and Tina and B.B. King and the Neville Brothers, the relatively unknown Neville Brothers, opening shows for them, Buddy Guy and Junior Wells. Eric Clapton had Gary Clark Jr. and Gatemouth Brown.
At Crossroads, right.
Well, I believe Gary did dates with Clapton overseas more recently. I'm not positive.
No, I believe it. I didn't know about
that. And it's great when those established artists mentor and point the spotlight at up-and-comers.
Right.
I wish that happened more often. I think that as much as I tend to listen to one kind of music, I think most people want a diet of many different genres of music.
Yeah.
Like a diet of many different
and
genres of food.
You start putting together connections, right? Like little things that are like this is quote unquote a country thing, or this is quote unquote a blues thing, or this quote unquote a rock thing, and it's like this cross pollination. There's actually a fantastic compilation record called Country Funk from I don't know if you've seen. It's a vinyl record with a whole bunch of different country songs that sound like funk from the late '60s and early '70s. There's some Link Ray in there, and I don't know. It's just some really cool stuff.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. So and I think that it'd be. You think that's the future for music? I mean, what is the future for the music industry?
I feel like I need to be on a mountaintop right now.
Yeah. You are on the mountaintop. You are the freaking head of Alligator Records.
Yeah, but
there's a lot of alligators.
But a lot of plastic alligators here. But I'm a specialist. I don't know. I can't answer your question. To me, building this label has always been putting one brick on top of another.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily see the full structure, but I know that the music can reach individual people, and to me, it's one sale, one fan at a time. Yeah. That's how you save the world, right? One person at a time.
But you also did do early on, much earlier than today, a lot of this cross-pollination stuff. For example, when you signed Professor Longhair, right? So you want to talk about that? Because that was your first big step. Is that right? Your first big step outside of the blues proper, if you will?
Well, sure. I mean, I didn't. Professor Longhair was the great New Orleans. How do you want to describe his music? Rumba boogie.
You gotta listen to
rock and roll.
Hopefully you have the publishing rights to some of his stuff so we can play it, because it's funky. It's
He's an amazing musician, amazing singer, amazing player.
Piano player from New Orleans. Yeah.
I just thought of that as part of a piece of the bigger blues picture, but I just loved his music. It just made me laugh.
Yeah.
And I pursued various ways of trying to sign him and failed a number of times, and then lucked into it because he changed managers, and his manager was willing to talk to a tiny, at that point, I think we might have been a 3-person company, maybe a 2-person company. And I went down there to New Orleans and made this record with the help of Dr. John, who was absolutely fabulous in the studio and arranged the horns and did a lot of other things. And released the record, and by that time, Professor Longhair had played private parties for Paul McCartney and toured in Europe, and he was not unknown. He was just a cult artist, but he had never had a record that was his latest recordings, that was the way he wanted to make a record. And we did the whole thing in 3 days.
Yeah.
Because he was so good. It didn't need longer than that.
And then it ended up being transcendental because...
Because on the day we released it, at the age of 59, he died.
Right.
Completely unexpectedly. I mean, he was performing and hanging out and living his regular life, and he had a heart attack and died. Literally the night before Street Date.
Wow.
And I took it a little bit. I'm not a very spiritual person, but he was really proud of the record. He thought that he had expressed himself and had been given more freedom in the studio and more respect than at least this is what he told me, than any other label had given him, and that he had been able to express himself.
Yeah.
And I hope that one of the last things he thought if he realized he was dying was, okay, I've established my legacy, and hopefully this guy from Chicago will carry it on for me. Will be the... I talk about myself as a bridge, and on one side is the artist, and on the other side is the potential audience.
Right.
And my job is to connect those two things,
Right.
being through a recording or a live performance. So that album, Crawfish Fiesta, named after a story that Professor Longhair told, is still in print. It's we've remastered it a couple of times. It's been available all over the world, and it holds up really well. And I'm so proud and honored that he trusted me to do that. And of course, as long as I'm around and as long as my successors are around, that music will be available for listening to as many ears as find it. Now, that's one of the great things about streaming and the great things about digital, which is records used to go out of print. Now, music is available. George Carlin used to have this routine: win every record ever made. Diesel trucks will back up to your door. But now, in fact, you can hear almost every record ever made.
Yeah. Which is amazing. And I guess the bad part of that is that there's too much competition for attention, and the streams don't pay. The good thing about it is you can discover it a lot easier because you can...
Well, that's why I'm hoping for China.
Right.
You're right. The streaming services pay horribly. Now, to their credit, they pay everybody horribly.
Right.
They don't pick on us little independents. In the early days of iTunes, they were going to pay less to the independents than to the majors, and that didn't last for any period of time.
That's wild.
Well, I don't know who made that decision, because there are lots of nice people who work for iTunes, but that wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
And I have to say, by the way, that Apple Music has been pretty supportive of Alligator and of the blues, as much as they are very hit-oriented. But they've put together some really nice blues playlists and tried to make a good blues experience. As of yet, we're not getting that kind of level of enthusiasm from Spotify, but there are some good people there who are trying to change that.
And as we wrap up this episode, I am going to sign off with a little bit more Hound Dog Taylor, going back to that song that we gave you a little bit of taste earlier called Give Me Back My Wig. Again, really high energy, and this is the kind of electric sound that Bruce first captured that launched Alligator Records into the blues label stratosphere. Next week, don't forget to tune in for part 2 of this amazing interview with Bruce Eichler. Now, to sign off, let's go to Hound Dog with Give Me Back My Wig.
have no feeling. Honey, buy you no wig at all. Then my mama told me, and your good friend too, when you get that wig, got to wait. You just wanna do you done. Give me back my wig. Honey, now let your head go, boy. Well, have no feeling.